This is the story of Daniel Hargrove and his fiancée Claire Whitmore. They had been together for 4 years before Daniel proposed, and in those 4 years he had built something he genuinely believed in. A partnership quiet enough to be mistaken for contentment, warm enough to be mistaken for love. Claire was articulate and beautiful in the way that makes people pay attention when she walked into a room. And Daniel, a structural engineer who spent his days calculating load-bearing capacities, had always admired the way she seemed to bear everything lightly. What he had not yet understood, what the story you are about to read will slowly make clear, is that there is a particular kind of person who appears to carry nothing because they have quietly placed their weight onto someone else. The engagement ring had been on Claire's finger for 7 months when Daniel first heard something that didn't fit. He would spend the next several weeks deciding what to do with what he knew. That decision would reveal more about him than anything he had ever designed. Daniel had a habit of arriving home at the same time every evening, 6:42, give or take 3 minutes, depending on the traffic light at the corner of Brennan and Fifth. Claire knew this. She had once teased him about it, saying she could set a clock by his headlights, and he had taken it as a small compliment, evidence of his reliability. He was the kind of man who believed that showing up on time was a form of love. Their apartment was on the 4th floor of a converted textile building in the older part of the city. Exposed brick, tall windows, the kind of place that felt intentional. Claire had decorated most of it. She had an eye for arrangement, for making spaces feel inhabited without feeling cluttered, and Daniel had deferred to her judgment almost entirely. His contribution was the bookshelf he'd built in the study, and the way he always made sure the kitchen light was left on when he came home late. Small gestures. He believed in small gestures. That Tuesday in late October, he came home to the smell of something cooking and the sound of Claire on the phone in the bedroom. He set his bag down, loosened his tie, and went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Through the partly open bedroom door, her voice was animated in a way it hadn't been with him in some time. Lighter, quicker, full of a kind of energy that he registered somewhere beneath conscious thought, the way you register a draft before you understand a window is open. He wasn't listening, that's important. He was not the kind of man who listened at doors. He went to the refrigerator, found it more empty than he expected, and remembered they'd talked about grocery shopping that weekend. He checked his phone for messages. He set the table, because that was something he did without being asked, and then he stood at the counter for a moment, doing nothing in particular, simply existing in the mild comfort of a weeknight. He heard her laugh, not the laugh she gave at dinner parties, measured and social. This was unguarded, slightly mean, the laugh of someone among intimates speaking freely. And then, just before the bedroom door pushed open and her voice became careful again, just before, he heard her say, with the relaxed certainty of someone who has said the same thing many times, "He trusts me completely. That's the whole point." Claire came into the kitchen still half smiling from the call. She kissed him on the cheek. She said dinner would be ready in 20 minutes, and did he want wine or water, and wasn't it cold out today? Daniel said water was fine. He watched her move around the kitchen, the practiced ease of her, the way she opened the oven with one hand and tucked her hair back with the other, and he felt something in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more structural, the way an engineer feels when he notices a number that doesn't quite align with the rest of the calculation. Not alarm, just attention. A shift in how carefully he was now going to read the blueprints. Dinner was good. They talked about her friend Nadia's upcoming move, about a documentary someone at his office had recommended, about whether they should confirm the venue deposit by the end of the month. Claire was warm, attentive, even. She asked about a project he'd mentioned last week, which surprised him slightly because he hadn't been sure she'd been listening. He answered her questions and asked his own. He did not mention what he had heard. Later, after she had fallen asleep, he lay in the dark with his eyes open, replaying the sentence with a dispassionate focus he brought to problems that required precision. He trusts me completely. That's the whole point. There were interpretations that were harmless. He was aware of this. But he was also a man who had built his career on understanding that a hairline crack in a foundation is not nothing simply because the building is still standing. He was not going to do anything rash. He was not built for rash. But he was going to pay closer attention. The first thing Daniel did, and he did it without drama, the way he approached all problems, was begin to look at the money. Not because it was the first place his mind went. He was not a suspicious person by nature, and he had always found the idea of monitoring a partner's finances vaguely distasteful. The kind of thing that indicated a relationship already in trouble. But the sentence he had overheard kept surfacing, and when he tried to place it in a context that made it innocent, he found himself circling back to the one area of their shared life where he had, in fact, trusted her completely and without examination, the joint account they'd opened 8 months earlier in preparation for the wedding, into which he had been depositing a fixed amount each month. Claire managed it. She had offered, and he had let her because she had more flexibility in her schedule, and because it had seemed like a gesture of partnership at the time. He looked at it on a Wednesday evening while she was at her yoga class. The balance was lower than it should have been by nearly $4,000. He sat with that number for a long time. He went through the transaction history slowly, the way he would go through an engineering report, looking for patterns rather than anomalies. What he found was not dramatic. There were no large single withdrawals, no suspicious transfers to an unknown account. Instead, there was a quiet, consistent pattern of small movements, transfers to an account he didn't recognize, averaging $300 to $400 at a time, spaced just far enough apart to avoid drawing attention. 8 transfers over 6 months. He did not confront her. He closed the laptop and made himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table in the particular silence of a person who is being very careful about what they do next. Over the following 2 weeks, he paid a different kind of attention. Not surveillance exactly. He wasn't recording her or checking her phone. It was more like the patient observation of an engineer assessing a site before committing to a design. He watched the shape of her days. He noticed that she was on her phone more than he'd registered before, and that she had taken to angling the screen slightly away from him. Not dramatically, just slightly, in the way a person adjusts to avoid glare. He noticed that she referenced Nadia frequently, Nadia who was going through a difficult time, Nadia who needed support, Nadia who had been the reason for 3 separate evenings out in the past month. He mentioned Nadia once, casually, asking if she was feeling better about the move. Claire said yes, much better, and moved on quickly. Daniel had met Nadia twice in 4 years. He knew where she lived. It took him very little effort on the following Thursday to note that no lights were on in Nadia's apartment when Claire had said she was there for dinner. He didn't follow Claire. He went home, cooked himself eggs, and thought carefully. What he was building. And he understood it as building. Because that was his language, was a picture. He was not yet sure what it showed. There was someone else, possibly. There was money being moved, certainly. There was a version of him being performed for the trusting, reliable, predictable Daniel, who arrived home at 6:42 and set the table and asked no inconvenient questions. He thought about the ring on her finger, the deposit on the venue, the life that was 3 months from being made legally permanent. He thought about how easy it would be to say something, to sit down across from her after dinner one night and simply ask. He could picture the conversation precisely, her initial confusion, then the calibration, then the version of the truth she would choose to offer him. He had no doubt she would offer him something convincing. She was very good at being convincing. He had admired this about her. He decided he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. He wasn't ready because he didn't have enough, and because he had learned from years of structural work, from years of watching buildings that looked stable reveal their weakness under pressure, that the worst thing you can do is apply force before you understand what you're dealing with. Apply force too early and the subject shifts, conceals, reinforces. You lose your window. He wanted to understand completely before he moved. That weekend, they went to a friend's dinner party. Daniel watched Claire across the table, The way she worked a room, the way she leaned into conversations, the way she touched his arm at exactly the right moments to signal a partnership that looked, from the outside, entirely intact. She was performing. He had always known she performed, socially, everyone did. But now he understood the performance extended further than he'd thought, and that he had been, for some time, part of the audience. On the drive home, she rested her head against the window and said she was tired, and she reached across and put her hand on his, and he let her, and he said nothing, and the city moved past them in the dark. Daniel had a colleague named Marcus, not a close friend, but the kind of person who knew things. Marcus had gone through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier and had emerged from it with the wary, practical knowledge of someone who had learned expensive lessons. Over lunch, without telling Marcus the specifics, Daniel asked him who he'd used for the legal work. He mentioned, vaguely, that he was being careful about some financial things ahead of the wedding. Marcus gave him a name. He also said, without being asked, that people rarely change what they think they can get away with until they discover they cannot. Daniel called the lawyer, a woman named Patricia Osai, on a Friday afternoon. He laid out what he knew, the transfers, the approximate amounts, the timeline, the joint account. He mentioned the wedding date. Patricia listened without interrupting and then told him clearly and without softening it that what he was describing, depending on intent and continuation, constituted financial misconduct within a domestic arrangement, and that there were ways to protect himself. She asked whether he wanted to end the engagement immediately or proceed carefully. He said he wanted to proceed carefully. They worked out an arrangement. The joint account would be restructured, not closed, which might alert Claire, but adjusted so that new deposits went into a separate account that only he could access. The remaining balance would stay, visible and apparently unchanged, a still surface over altered depths. Patricia also advised him to document everything he had already found, which he did that same evening, meticulously, the way he documented anything important. He did not feel triumphant doing this. He felt something more like grief doing an administrative task. The emotions present but managed, set aside until the work was finished. The confrontation, when it came, was not planned for a specific night. It arrived on a Sunday in December, 3 weeks before Christmas, because Claire pushed it there herself without knowing it. She had been talking for several days about an investment opportunity, something a friend had mentioned, something that required committing a significant sum quickly. She was enthusiastic about it in a way that Daniel recognized, now, as rehearsed enthusiasm. She mentioned it at dinner on Sunday with the careful timing of someone who has chosen their moment. He listened. He let her finish. He asked 2 or 3 questions that sounded like curiosity and were, in fact, very precise. Then he set down his fork and said, quietly, "Claire, I know about the account." She went still, not dramatically, just a small, complete stillness. He didn't say anything else. He waited. What followed was not a screaming match. It was several minutes of silence, and then Claire, in a voice that was controlled and almost offended, said that she had been managing their money and that the transfers were for something she hadn't been ready to discuss yet. Something about a deposit of her own, a private financial arrangement she'd been building toward as a sense of security, because she had always needed to feel financially independent, and he had never fully understood that about her. It was not a bad explanation. It was even partially true, in the way that the most effective deceptions always contain a true thing. Daniel said, "What's the account number?" She paused for just a fraction too long. He said, "I'd like to see it." She said she didn't have it on her. She said he was making her feel accused. She said she thought they trusted each other. He said very gently, "We do. That's what I thought." He got up and cleared the plates. He was not cold doing it, not theatrical. He was simply someone who had said what needed to be said and was now finished with the part of the evening that had required it. Claire watched him from the table for a long moment. She did not bring up the investment opportunity again. 2 days later, he moved out of the bedroom into the study, explaining it as insomnia. He'd been sleeping badly and didn't want to disturb her. She accepted this with a watchfulness that told him she was recalibrating. He let her recalibrate. He had already talked to Patricia about the next steps. The engagement was not broken yet. He was not ready to break it, but the building had been evacuated, quietly and in order, and all that remained now was the paperwork. The engagement ended on a Tuesday in January, without ceremony. Daniel sat across from Claire at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten every dinner for 3 years, and told her that he'd had the account reviewed and that the full picture was documented, and that he would not be pursuing any legal action as long as the transferred funds were returned. He had discussed this with Patricia, who had agreed it was the cleaner resolution. He said he thought getting married would be a mistake. He said it the way he said most things, without decoration. Claire returned the money in 2 installments. She did not admit to anything beyond poor communication. She moved out within the month, taking what was hers and nothing that wasn't, perhaps because she understood, by then, that he had counted everything. In the months that followed, Daniel noticed the shape that grief takes when it is not dramatic. When there is no explosion to organize the feelings around, no clear villain to be angry at, no pure moment of betrayal to replay. What he had was more diffuse than that. It was the loss of an ordinary Tuesday, the kitchen light he no longer needed to leave on, the table he still set for 2 out of habit before he caught himself. It was realizing that he had loved a version of Claire that had been, at least in part, constructed for his benefit, and not knowing where that version ended and the real one began. He thought about this more than he wanted to. He continued working. He took on a project that required more travel than usual, and he was grateful for it. Not as escape, exactly, but as the kind of full occupation that lets the quieter grief do its work at the margins. He called his mother more often. He declined most social invitations for a while, not from depression, but from a simple preference for his own company, the recalibration of a man who had recently discovered that he had been less perceptive than he considered himself to be. Claire, he heard through mutual acquaintances, had moved across the city and was seeing someone. She had apparently told several people that the engagement had ended because Daniel was emotionally unavailable. He absorbed this without much reaction. He understood that people construct the story they need in order to continue, and that her story required a different distribution of fault. He didn't blame her for needing it. He simply noted it the way he noted most things and moved on. What lingered, and this surprised him, was not anger at Claire. It was something turned inward, a question about himself. How long had he not been looking? He was a man who prided himself on precision, on seeing structures clearly, and yet he had lived inside a compromised one for longer than he wanted to calculate. He had loved the ease of not asking questions. He had loved being trusted, and loved even more being someone who trusted, because it made him feel, quietly, like a good man. There is a way in which trust can be a form of looking away. He understood this now. He was not sure he had before. Spring arrived gradually. He started running in the mornings, nothing ambitious, just 20 minutes through the park behind his building. He replaced some of the furniture. He finished the bookshelf in the study and put books on it that were only his. Small reorganizations. The quiet work of becoming the sole occupant of a space that had, until recently, held more than one life. He was not over it. He was not sure he was meant to be yet. He thought that the goal, if grief had a goal, was not to be finished with it, but to carry it in a way that didn't cause you to walk unevenly. He was, he thought, beginning to manage this. They saw each other once more, in September, at a gallery opening that neither of them had known the other would attend. It was the kind of event, low lights, warm wine, small clusters of people performing appreciation for paintings, that is easy to leave if you need to. Daniel didn't leave. He saw her across the room before she saw him. She was with someone. The man she was seeing, presumably, tall and attentive in the way of someone still in the early, careful phase of a relationship. She was laughing at something he'd said, and Daniel watched her for a moment, with the detached interest of someone looking at a place they used to live. He could see her clearly now, without the layering of hope that had softened everything before. She was a person, complicated, probably more wounded than she had ever allowed herself to seem, skilled at self-presentation in ways that had made her both magnetic and unreliable. He did not feel angry looking at her. He felt something more like the mild, clarifying sadness of understanding a thing too late to be useful. She noticed him eventually. She said his name with only a slight hesitation. They stood together for a few minutes. They said the things you say. How are you? How is work? This is a strange coincidence. They were both careful. He was careful because he had chosen to be. He suspected she was careful because she wasn't sure what he might say, and the uncertainty showed in the way she stood, her weight slightly back, a fraction more formal than the occasion required. He asked about her work. She asked about a project she remembered him mentioning. It was not a warm conversation, but it was not hostile either. It was the conversation of two people who had known each other well and now knew each other at the distance of what had happened. At some point she said, "I should have been more honest with you." She said it quietly, not as a performance, or if it was a performance. It was a very private one, the kind you do for yourself. He looked at her and thought about everything that sentence did not contain. All the specific dishonesty it was smoothing over into a general acknowledgement, and he thought about whether to say so. He said, "I should have paid more attention." She looked at him for a moment as though she wasn't sure how to take this. Whether it was graciousness or something cooler than graciousness. Perhaps it was both. He wasn't entirely sure himself. Her companion came over and was introduced and shook Daniel's hand, and Daniel said it was nice to meet him and meant it in the uncomplicated way, because the man had done nothing to him. They spoke briefly about the paintings, something abstract in the corner that all three of them pretended to have an opinion about, and then Claire said they should find their hosts. And Daniel said of course, and they separated with the low-key care of people managing a situation that could have been more difficult than it was. He stayed another half hour, looked at the paintings with actual attention this time, and then walked home through the September air. The city was doing what cities do in early autumn, the particular quality of light in the evenings, golden and faintly sorrowful, the days shortening without announcement. He walked without hurrying. He thought about the conversation, not obsessively, but in the way you turn something over briefly before setting it down. I should have paid more attention. He had said it to be truthful, not to be kind. And it was true. He had preferred the building to the inspection, had loved the structure more than the analysis. He had wanted the life they were building together to be load-bearing and had not done enough, early enough, to verify that it was. The failure was not only hers. He had participated in his own blindness, had chosen the comfort of a trust he hadn't tested over the small discomfort of seeing things as they were. He did not think this absolved Claire of anything. He simply thought that placing all the fault in one place was a way of avoiding the more complicated and useful understanding. He arrived home. He turned on the light in the kitchen. He stood for a moment in the ordinary silence of a place that was entirely his. The bookshelf in the study, the table he no longer set for two, the quiet that was no longer absence, but simply quiet. There are buildings that fail from the outside in, pressure applied, collapse from the edges. And there are buildings that fail from the inside out, from something unexamined in the foundation, long before any visible crack appears. Daniel had spent his career learning to see the difference. He had not always applied that knowledge to the places he actually lived. That, he thought, was the thing worth carrying forward. He put on the kettle. He sat at the table. Outside, the September light was doing its slow work, pulling the day down into evening with no particular hurry, indifferent and beautiful, the way that time passes when no one is watching. He did not think about Claire every day after that. He thought about the questions she had made necessary. That, in the end, was her most lasting contribution to him. Not the damage, which healed, but the precision she had forced him to develop. The habit of looking at what holds things up and asking, plainly and without sentiment, whether it is actually strong enough.